So let's work on our thesis. So it took me a little while. I would say 20 minutes, half an hour. It might take an hour. Might take an hour and a half. Um, the some of this stuff's hard work. I mean, really hard work, and it definitely takes time. Writing a good thesis statement might take you 5 minutes, or it might take you, over an hour. This took me at least 20 minutes, maybe half an hour. It was at least 20 though. And I've written a lot of these before, but it's basically, you can have a one sentence thesis. You could use a semicolon. It's generally better not to. So if you can create a sort of nuanced, textured, somewhat sophisticated thesis, that's where it's possible to argue that and defend it well and persuasively, then you can garner a high mark. If it's something simple, like cigarettes are bad for you, something that's like really a simplistic argument, then it's just going to be, you're just going down the wrong rabbit hole, essentially. Or you're just going down the wrong road. I don't know if this is perfect, but I think it's pretty good. All right, so although Walt Whitman's Drum Taps, first O songs for a Prelude, acknowledges the atrocities of war, it is through the speaker's use of alliteration, line breaks, personification, and word choice that it illustrates the poem's overwhelming emphasis on war's inherent ability to bring people together collectively to fight and work toward a common and largely altruistic goal. It's a big thesis. It's nuanced. It's talking about, okay, it acknowledges the atrocities of war, because we're going to mention that. We could have deleted that. We could have just said, through the speaker's use of alliteration, blank, blank. This Walt Whitman speaker in Drum Taps shows an overwhelming emphasis on war's inherent ability to bring people together. But I thought that making it sort of the counter, the what the poem acknowledges, and then what the poem is focusing on, I think that adds a dimension to the thesis statement. I believe that it's a stronger thesis statement than if we had just omitted this. Because war, it's inherent, right? Even in the language, it's inherent that war is bloody. They got dust, the blood of the city up, armed, the cry everywhere, there's flags, there's tearful parting. I mean, there's excitement, but it's still obvious that there's stuff going on. There's, kissing, mom's kissing the son, son's kissing the mom goodbye. It might be the last time. Even though he says the word war a lot, he says danger, crisis, the red business. I mean, so I want to comment on that. I believe that a good thesis can set the stage for a much better paper than a very weak thesis. So I would spend a decent amount of time working on a strong thesis. I like this thesis. I think it's solid. I think if it gets too unwieldy, I know I use that word a lot, but if it gets just too, like, where it's just going to break, and you'll feel it. Like, the more you read, the more you study, the more you work, the more you go to class, the more you pay attention, and the more work you might do on your own. I read a lot of stuff on my own, a lot of stuff. And my mom and dad, they got us, a decent number of books. We had these books called childcraft books. We used to have this thing called the encyclopedia. But way before Wikipedia, these were actually books. I know those are like relics now. But I would flip through those all the time. We used to have like science books. She bought us a bunch of science books. So we just, but this takes time. So writing a thesis takes time. Now, largely altruistic, that's another like flourish, another nuance of this thesis, right? So we might delete this. We might delete largely altruistic, and it just says work toward a common goal. But I think that this might really punch up the thesis and punch up the quality of the essay as well. So, but we're keeping that as a possibility. So you know what? Let's make it bracketed, because then it lets us know that if we can't argue it, or if it's too much, or if it adds, if we're going to do another page and a half just to argue that it might not be necessary, because this still really is solid. I was only going to do 3 things, but we've got to do word choice, because just the word choice of red business, and there's just some word choices that they use that is not necessarily imagery, it's just word choice, that I think, let's just use 4. Use 4: alliteration, line breaks, personification, and word choice. So then you're always going to wonder, so then when you look at, so my big recommendation is, when you've got a long sentence like this and you're not sure what version of the verb you should use, what tense, if it's singular or plural, you want to just strip it apart and just cut out all the extraneous words and just focus on the sort of the crux of the phrase, right? So the speaker's use, right? It is through the speaker's use of blank. So we can also say the speaker's use of blank, right? These things, these 4 things. The speaker's use of these things that illustrate, or the speaker's use of these things illustrate, right? So the use, you could even change this to the use. The use. The use of these things illustrate. The use illustrates. The use of these things illustrates. This is something that's hugely helpful, that I highly recommend that you do every time you write an essay. If you finish a test in class and you've got 20 minutes left, go back over the test. Just milk every minute that's given to you. And that's one of the things you should do, is just go and make sure that the verbs are in correct tense, correct form, etc. Extremely helpful. So that illustrates the poems. And then this is another thing, is you're saying that the poem acknowledges, right? Which is true, because you could either say Whitman acknowledges, the speaker acknowledges, or the poem acknowledges. So we're saying the poem acknowledges. Although Walt Whitman's poem acknowledges the atrocities of war, which it does, because the actual words acknowledge. It is through the speaker's use of alliteration, line breaks, personification, and word choice that illustrates the poem's overwhelming emphasis on war's inherent ability to bring people together, collectively fight, and work toward a common and largely altruistic goal. Now, why didn't I say, although Walt Whitman's speaker, or the speaker in Walt Whitman's blank, drum taps, acknowledges the atrocities of war? It's because I didn't want to use his or her. I could have said it is through the speaker's use. It is through his or her's use, which is a little bit awkward, or his or her use, that illustrates his or her. I just didn't want to use his or her. In a thesis, you could do it, but if you can, it's just like using a parenthesis in a thesis statement. It's generally better not to. It's almost always better not to. I don't even know if I've ever used a parenthesis in a thesis statement. I don't think I've ever done that once. I've used a semicolon before, and I know that's normally a no-no, because you want to use in one sentence. However, based on that class, that teacher, what we were reading, the work I'd done before, the work, my argument, etc., all of these factors, it still worked, and I still, earned a solid mark. But that's just experience, and that's just knowing that teacher thinks it's okay. Some teachers are very strict, though, and they won't be okay with that. They won't be copacetic with a semicolon in a thesis. But it depends on the class. Depends on the teacher and whatnot. So here I could have used a semicolon. It's definitely a full sentence, but I don't think we need it. I think that although I think it's solid, although Waldman's drum taps, and it's a contrast, right? It's like war is atrocious, but then it also brings people together, And that's really what the thesis of every line is in this poem. So a good thesis is very helpful and illustrates as the correct way to write the word. In the next video, we will go over a bunch more of these. Now that we've got our thesis, now we're going to know which parts that we are going to pick, which words, and we also know that we're only going to use alliteration, line breaks, personification, and word choice. Thank you very much.